Okay, my name is Robert Franklin. I'm conducting an oral history interview with Dennis Brunson on October 18th, 2016. The interview is being conducted on the campus of Washington State University Tri-Cities. I will be talking with Dennis about his experiences working at the Hanford site. And for the record, can you state and spell your full name for us?
My name is Dennis, Dennis, Brunson, Brunson.
Great. Okay, so best place to begin is the beginning. So when and where were you born?
I was born in La Grande, Oregon
Okay.
in 1943.
And how did you come to Washington?
My family moved beginning of my junior year in high school to La Crosse,
Okay.
which is up towards Pullman.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad was a foreman on the cattle ranch, and that's where
Was your dad in the cattle business for most of his?
he was a farmer, and we owned a meat market in eastern Oregon, and that's how I got up here.
Okay.
And
And then you went to high school in La Grande?
in
Or
La
La Crosse.
Crosse,
Sorry.
yeah. And I married my high school sweetheart, who was a year ahead of me, and I was a football player, and I had some success at playing football, and had been given an offer to play football at Columbia Basin College in Pasco, back in the day when they had an outstanding football program. And on my way to that end, I damaged my neck severely in a football game, my last football game at high school, and I could no longer play football.
Oh.
But I was already had plans to go to CBC, and I followed through. So I came to CBC, and I took a class there that was a special class that Boeing had initiated, basically to produce illustrators for Boeing Company in Seattle, and they didn't have near enough technical illustrators, and so I went through that program, and found that there was a pretty high need for illustrators, and they used them here at Hanford as well. And so my wife worked for General Electric, and her boss at the time and my future boss played golf together, and we had planned on going to Seattle to start my career over there, and ultimately I was hired to come to work at Hanford, and as an illustrator for Vitro Engineering Company.
Okay. And so what kind of projects did you work on while in this first job at Hanford?
Okay, I did a lot of because I was an illustrator and an artist. I was put in the piping department, which was a large section because they were retooling the Hanford site at that time to process chemicals. And my first job basically was as-built drawings. I would go into zones where the pipe fitters had recreated the new version, but I would go in and follow blueprints to make sure that what went on the final drawings was the way it was built. And oftentimes there were things that the designers couldn't see, and so they would get someone like me to go in and sit and draw all these things out to double check and make sure that it was as built. And that wasn't always an easy task because some of the zones we were in were very hot.
Right.
And we'd have to draw with with coveralls on and headgear and gloves, and it was a slow process.
How would so obviously all that gear can be clean, but what you're drawing on then might also soak up radiation as well,
Well,
or
there was a possibility that you could be contaminated, and they were very careful, and which I was thankful for. I always had a radiation monitor with me.
hmm
If something in the atmosphere was airborne, he knew about it because he had an indicator, and we would get out of there. And that happened a few times, but wasn't all that bad. And
did you work what kinds of did you work all over site doing these as builds, or is there any building or buildings that come to mind?
well, in the 200 area mostly is where I did that. In the TU and B buildings, that they were, I think they were at that time they were retooling the canyon buildings or some of the cells for processing thorium, and that's what basically what we were doing. When I wasn't doing as-built drawings, I worked as an illustrator and a design draftsman, and I was trained well to do that, and I really enjoyed it.
And when did you start this first? When did you start at Hanford? Do you remember what year?
Yeah, it was 1964.
And how long did you work as a illustrator and doing the as builds?
For that, during that phase of my career, it was 2 years. I worked there 2 years, and then I went back to my wife's family farm, and we leased one of my father-in-law's ranches, and tried to make a living raising wheat and sheep and cattle and all of that. And
What was the reason for that change, or why? Why'd you?
why did I leave Hanford
Yeah,
and go
why
back
did-
to the farm?
Yeah.
Well, it was an offer that I couldn't refuse. My father-in-law was having health issues, and he came to me and said, "Hey, I need some help," and so we did what we had to do,
Okay.
and we tried to make a living. But I was glad that I had a connection at Hanford, because in 1970 we came back and moved to Richland and started with Wadco Corporation as a technical illustrator.
Wadco. And do you remember what Wadco stands for?
Well, it depends on who you were talking to. If it was Westinghouse Advanced Development Corporation, but the locals here called it Wild Ass Development Corporation because the way they had a way of getting things done. And my reason for being there, I was hired as an illustrator because they had taken over the FFTF design and management, and it had been in thought process for several years prior to that, and they took over, and there were services that were provided to the contractors here, but they had a difficult time. Westinghouse or Wadco had a difficult time getting what they needed in the time frames that they were being asked to deliver, and so they had to go out and get some service people of their own to keep that flowing, and that's how I came in. I was the first illustrator they had.
And I noticed that a lot of the material you brought in today, which we'll show some of that later, I noticed a lot of that pertains to FFTF.
Yes.
And so it seems you were married to that. That was a large part of your illustrator or graphic design work, was for that reactor.
When I started with Wadco, and and that melded right into Westinghouse, it was the same parent company. They just changed the structure, and I went from there until Boeing took over, that was 17 years.
Okay.
So I did that for 17 years. So that's the reason I have my very first job at Wadco was another gentleman and I were asked to go down to Safeway and buy a 50-pound sack of flour. And we went out to the desert, and there was a post out there where the center of the reactor core was. This is before they scraped anything away. And we made a big giant X in the sand and made it nice and tidy, and so that from an aerial photograph, it appeared to be a giant X. X marks the spot for this. That was prior to for the first excavation, and so that was the first thing that we did. I mean, that was noteworthy, and that was and the next day or two after they had photographically recorded that, they came in with the earth moving equipment to start the laydown of the bottom of the reactor. And so that's that was something that I did that was unusual.
So you were there right at the
in the beginning,
Genesis, yeah. Literally at the center of the
center of the project,
center of the reactor. So what other kinds of work did you do in that 17-year span for Wadco?
I started out as an illustrator and we worked night and day, 7 days a week, forever and ever and ever. It went on. It was a wild ride, but we produced visual aids, slides and view graphs, and posters for poster sessions, and a lot of them. In addition to that, we also created an ongoing report of activities because we were building something new that had never been done, and so we had, in addition to the graphics department, we had photographers and an editorial staff and the typing pool and all of the support that is required to put out reports, technical reports, and it was a large group, and we were asked to create a history as we went along, and that was, we were part of a national lab, and that's something you had to do, and it's in records form somewhere if our computers can read it.
I believe a lot of that material is actually in hard copy in our collections.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
I've gone through a lot of FFTF boxes.
Yeah.
And so you were the first person in this department then, and so how big did this department end up becoming? And did you take a supervisory role?
Yes. At one time we had around 25 people in that particular graphics department, and I started out as an illustrator, and then was promoted to senior illustrator, and then supervisor or art director, and then in a short while, I was promoted to manager of media services, which included the graphics department and photography and audiovisual, which was one tight group. And then as time went on over a few years, I was assigned other management in the communications department, and that's what I did. And I sort of then after 17 years when Boeing came to town, things, when we went into Boeing, I worked as manager of several departments, the photography audiovisual motion picture group, and so anyway, I'm getting off track, but
No.
that's kind of the trail that I had through the process. But the entire time that we were working there, I've seen other groups that they provided a service but were never considered, or they never felt like they were part of a team. And that was the one nice thing about the graphics and photography departments. You were part of a team, and we were involved with just about everything that went through the company, and we were appreciated by the management, because they'd have been in trouble without a good group of people who were cooperative and willing to work every night and into the wee hours of the morning, and still come back the next day and smile about it, and it was fun. You have to remember that people like in those kind of service departments, by and large, they're people that are getting paid good money to do their hobby.
Right.
And so the photographers loved the challenge of going into a hot zone and taking pictures, and it was something they looked forward to. It was something they could learn from and create new techniques to do a good job. And so that's a pretty good base for contented employees if you can have that. And we were fortunate that most of us were about the same age, and we had fun. We had potlucks. We did all the things. We were rewarded for our efforts by the company, by the management, and so it was a feel good. We felt good that we provided service, and we have, I brought here 40 years of samples of work that we did that is proof.
Right.
And it's something that the people who are in those type jobs can take this to a potential new job, say, this is what I do, here it is. And it's something that you can look at and see. And most all of us retired or are retiring from that line of service. Everybody's gotten older, of course, and now everybody runs a computer. But it was that's the way. That's how it worked for us.
Right. Yeah, so, a lot of those materials are in the Hanford collection. So
yes,
they've been identified as being very historically valuable. So I think that's a testament to the work of your group.
Yeah. Well, the models, you have so many fantastic models in your collection. And I don't know that you have more than what I saw in the walkthrough at the other day at the open house. Mm-hmm. I suspect that you have more of them somewhere, because there was a lot of them that we produced.
What's in the collection right now is everything that's been identified to be put in the collection. If there's models somewhere else, they just aren't part of our collection. Yeah. So the DOE hasn't put them in the collection. So, yeah. I hope there are too, because they're very they have their own preservation challenges, but they're very engaging. Yeah. People really like the models. So you worked for Westinghouse for 17 years. Mm-hmm. And so that would have been from 70 to 87. And then, so in 87 is also significant because that's our kind of shutdown of production year. Mm-hmm. So who did you work for, or describe that transition to your new...
From Westinghouse to Boeing?
Yeah.
That was in my eyes, I was very, very disappointed that we went to work for Boeing. We were given away to Boeing as part of the contract. And Boeing was given all of the services photography, video, graphics, printing, publication services. Those were all part of the deal. Westinghouse gave Westinghouse and Boeing partnered, and the Westinghouse part of it, they took a bunch of labs from Battelle, or gave some to Battelle. I'm sorry, and Battelle had a wonderful photography department and graphics department, and they, along with the Westinghouse services, were all given to Boeing. And Boeing, it was Boeing Computer Services, and the manager there wasn't all that familiar with what we provided for the site. Okay. And wasn't all that interested in finding out. And he didn't last very long. But the new management came in, and they provided. They were good. They were good, a good company to work for at that time. But because of that, people like myself, I went there as a manager of the graphics department, and was quickly asked to go work and put out a big fire at the Publications, Printing, and Reproduction Services Group, which was a large group. And so I was there for a year managing that group. And when the manager of photography and video, which was 65 people, professionals there, he decided to retire early. And so I was asked then to go take over that group, which was a challenge, and I really liked it. It was a real good challenge, and we had several large groups throughout down this part of Hanford, and we were asked basically to reduce that by half. As far as the square footage and all that, so we did a lot of consolidating and all that. And at the same time that was going on, we were sort of downsizing, as when the digital world suddenly was upon us, and we were challenged. We had one of the nicest color labs in the Federal Building that was in the Northwest. I mean, it was fabulous. And we had a large black and white lab in the 300 area, and so it.
Sorry, can you just describe what a color lab and a black? You mean for reproduction or for photographs?
For photographs.
Okay.
And they is quite complex, and I can give you an oversight of that, but it'd really be great if you can get a Dan Ostergaard or someone like that to sit in this chair and give you a real version of the macrographs and things that they did as it relates to fuel, the nuclear fuel production. And it was a whole new world, and it was an unusual world that they lived in. But by and large, we had photographers, and this was a collection of probably 10 really high-quality, well-educated technical photographers that provided service for the site, and that included hot cells, and we had permanent staff in the 200 area that provided really hard work as far as recording things that in cells where they were doing testing and what have you. Mm-hmm. And we had a couple guys that flew aerials every week. They would fly and take pictures of the development of our whatever was happening on the site. Mm-hmm. And and we had the black and white lab was in 300 area, and they produced all of the negatives. They processed. They did a lot of the printing. They did color printing as well in a small scale. But in the Federal Building, we had a full-blown color printing process that went on there, and you could do photographs that were 6 feet wide and 40 feet long, and we had that ability, and that work was done mostly for public relations type activities. I mean, that was, but it went. They did a lot of macrographs, and that's, you'd take a fuel pin or a piece of fuel, carbon, put it under a 1,000,000-volt electron microscope, and enlarge that pin up to like 4 feet wide, and it'd be done in sections. And we had folks in the lab that would cut all these things apart and put them back together. It's kind of hard to describe unless you have a picture of it. But they ended up being this big macrograph that they would then rephotograph and reduce down, and that was, they used that for the research on what happens to nuclear fuels when it's irradiated.
Oh, okay.
And so it was a technical process, and photography and graphics both were the last. They were the last people in the line when something had to be. A report had to go in, or somebody was getting on an airplane to go to D.C. or Virginia or Europe or someplace for a critical meeting. They change and change and change right up to the last minute, and then dump it on us. And our challenge was to produce something that met their needs in the remaining wee hours of the morning. And
you mentioned it earlier, so I'd like to go back to it. Can you describe, because the digital revolution, right, affected us all in terms of our computer use, but I imagine it especially would have affected the photography and graphic arts departments. And
yes.
So I'd like you to kind of talk about that change, that whole transformation of that technology.
That was a process that we all went through, depending on what seat we were sitting at the time. I'll start with graphics. In the graphics department, we had assigned a young lady the job of gathering the data for our first computer systems. And she was looking at things on the PC side and on the Apple side. Mm-hmm. And at that time, the Macintosh had software that was user-friendly, and we all we went that way with the Apple Mac.
And in many cases, they're still often the computers of choice for graphics and audio video.
Certainly. But what we ran up against, especially with Boeing say, no way, we're not going to go with anything Apple. You kiss your apples goodbye, because we're not going to go that route. But they didn't have the software development on the PC side that met our needs, and so we'd keep putting them off, and I know some of the departments now are all back on that side of the fence, but that went on in the graphics side, but on the photography side it was a real struggle, because our photographers came from the old school film. And fortunately, we had a few guys who were advocates for the digital end, and helped us stumble through that. And it was a rough journey, but it changed everything we did. I mean, we were a group of 75 people. There are now 0 photographers at Hanford that we know of, that I know of. They've all went by the way of they're extinct.
Right. The technology now is, you might not get always the same quality, but
No.
but now that everyone has a camera for most purposes, that you can document
Yeah.
a lot of the history out there. Yeah. So in the graphics side, are you talking mostly about CAD software, or is that what kinds of software did you use for the graphics side?
We used freehand and Photoshop and those type of Illustrator type softwares, and the I'll the I'm drawing a blank here. You cut this out, I guess. Can we stop just a sec?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Okay, get my head on straight.
Yeah, no worries.
Where I was going to ask me the question again.
I was just what kinds of software did you primarily use?
Okay.
In
In the graphics side.
in the graphics process. Yeah.
Yeah, it was on the Mac side. It was freehand was our base. When I was heavily involved with it, that was the base. On the PC side, we used CorelDRAW, and we used Illustrator, and those were kind of the basic ones that I was familiar with.
When did you feel, because computer power has, almost exponentially increased since the invention of the microchip, and so when did you finally feel, from a professional standpoint, that these computer technologies were on par or had surpassed a lot of what had been done then by analog technologies, or did you ever feel that it was that way?
Yeah, when I was at the end of my career, I left there in 2008. By about that time, we were overcome by good technology, and some before that, some of the new guys that came in who were really well trained. They made computers do things that you wonder, how in the world did they do that, and you're kind of glad you were getting old, and I'll give you just a brief. At one point when I was with Lockheed, I was asked to go to work on a proposal in the Washington D.C. area for the FBI. And over there most of the summer, about 35 days, 40 days, I guess.
Oh.
And I had familiarity with and a lot of experience with freehand. And so the last thing I was told before I left was, oh, by the way, they don't use Macs, and they use CorelDRAW and on PC, and I looked at him and I said, I've never done any Corel work. And, well, you better get started. So I'm getting on, packing my suitcase to go put my life on the line in Virginia or Maryland. And so I had a real learning curve first week there. And I made it. And I got so that I really liked the program. But it was everything's about the same, except it's a little different.
Right, the basics are probably pretty easily transferable, but there's the details and
Yep,
kind of the special
that's
features.
exactly it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how long did you work for Boeing, and when did Boeing transition? And went from Boeing to Lockheed?
Boeing to Lockheed.
And when did that?
I think that was 9 years later. I think I worked there for Boeing for 9 years
Okay.
before Lockheed came to town, and I think that I have it written down somewhere.
Right. No,
Yeah,
that's
it all
understandable.
gets
And then you worked there until May 2000, until 2008.
2008.
Can you talk about so you worked for Westinghouse, Hanford, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. Can you talk about the kind of I mean, you talked a little bit about that attitude between the change in contractors, but was there a kind of like a culture change as well? Did your group have to kind of readjust, or were you kind of sheltered from the larger storm of contractors?
Well,
Contractor change.
We in a group in some groups it was no problem at all, no hassle, no nothing to worry about. In our groups, we worked at a level in the company where we were part of all this stuff, and so when we lost our mothership, so to speak, there were hurt feelings, and there was a lot of unknown canyons to go down as far as we worried about it. We worried about it, these changes breaking us up and tearing us apart, and it always seemed to do that to some extent. The Lockheed was different than the others, Lockheed Martin, because they were still tied to Lockheed corporate. There was a Hanford and corporate, and half of the stuff that we did, we were working for Lockheed Martin corporate, but we were here, and it was there were a lot more challenges for organization, and it was more contractor supported than it was Hanford supported. I was kind of the Hanford guy,
Right.
For years, and I was an art director where most of the old Hanford numbers, everything would come to me, and we would then get it done and get it filed correctly and all of that. And but there were times like when I went to work for on this FBI proposal that was purely Lockheed Martin.
Okay.
And so that gave people like me a chance to learn other things and do other things, and it made a better person out of all of us. Because we got to do things that we were tied to the Hanford fence previously. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think that answered it really
but
well.
you have to remember, whenever a contractor came in to take over, there was a proposal. The Department of Energy or AEC or whoever we were at the time, they said, "Hey, you guys have been doing this work for X number of years. We want to see whether we can get it done cheaper." Mm-hmm. And so every time that happened, every time somebody else took over the contract, there's things that were lost that we were used to. And whether that was good or bad, most of the time you thought it was bad because that's not the way it's always been done.
Right.
It's just fear of change. And there was a lot of downsizing that went on. Mm-hmm. And so groups that had 65, 68 people in them, suddenly they were down to 20, and that meant people went somewhere else to work. And so there were layoffs, and so...
Right, because as you mentioned, a lot of the point of this bidding and contracts was to get
Yeah.
the work done at the lowest price.
Yeah.
And so there's an incentive there to cut cost where you could.
Yeah, when we transferred, I'd been at Westinghouse 17 years, and I provided quite a bit of work for the proposal, and my manager, who was Glenda Moulthrop, she was the manager of technical communications at the time. She went back to Pittsburgh and worked for almost 6 months as part of that team, and I took her job during that time frame, and we were so excited that we won the bid, and come back and find that sorry guys, you're not going to be Westinghouse anymore, you're going to Boeing. And that was very disheartening to those of us who had been branded with the Circle W on our butt. It was we were disappointed, and feelings were hurt, and it caused all kinds of trauma for a lot of people for a short time.
Speaking of branding, for work done on did each contractor have its own kind of corporate branding that it used on all of its own publications? Yep. Used at Hanford? Did you have to learn a whole new set of kind of corporate graphic identity each time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and oftentimes, and there were also Department of Energy had their own branding, if you will. Mm-hmm. So there was always a little muddy water about the use of logos and the use of the fonts that were used, the different kinds of fonts, and the colors and all of that, and it was an interesting journey. I would put it that way.
Brand identity is almost sacred. It
was. Westinghouse, Boeing, and Lockheed Martin all had extreme control on their. They had someone at headquarters that had an eye on everything we did, because we were always getting our hands slapped. You can't do that. Well,
I'll tell you, it's the same here too.
Yeah.
Everyone's interested in preserving the brand identity. Was the majority of your work, or I guess maybe can you describe the balance of your work? Was it for public consumption or private consumption, or a mixture of both? The work that you did at Hanford.
It depends on at what phase of my career.
Okay.
There were times in the early part of the career that everything I touched went into a report or a presentation for the site.
Okay.
And
so for internal consumption.
Internal, and as time went on. Some of that, at that time, most of it was, you had to have a Q clearance to be there to begin with. Mm-hmm. And most everything was pretty private, because on FFTF, that was a new technology, and we didn't do an awful lot of sharing with the public. But then as time went on and you started doing other things in the career path, you got to do things that were more fun, public presentations and work for the science centers and things like that, and displays and what have you.
Did your group do work for the Hanford Science Center?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And
can you how involved were you with the Hanford Science Center?
As required, we had projects that we would work through, and there were several contractors that provided the same service. Like FFTF, we did a lot of models, as you already know, for FFTF, because it was all new. It was new technology, it was new thought process, and it was new. So. And we had a lot of visitors from throughout the world. We developed the Science Center in the 400 area out at FFTF that ultimately became the Crest Museum. They moved that building downtown.
Was it the building that Allied Arts is in, right? That's the former Crest, right?
No, the Crest is just a couple notches down.
Sorry, I'm pretty new to the area. I moved here after Crest had closed down. But so the Crest building though is a former building.
It was built at the 400 area on a little ridge overlooking the reactor, and it was put up in a hurry, and we built a beautiful displays in there and you could you could drive out there without a badge, and you could go in and go through the science center and the visitor center, we called it FFTF Visitor Center, and it told the entire story. We had visual presentation. We had like 6 projectors that showed these. You could sit through a 30-minute 35 millimeter slide presentation with sound and all that. Oh. And so that's where most of those models were ultimately ended up. Some of them were actually in the reactor building itself, where visitors would come in and you couldn't go in there because it was hot, but you could look at this model and they could point out various activities that were going on.
Did you do any work at all at the Crest Museum?
Personally, I did not, but our staff did.
Okay.
Mike Reisenauer did a lot of work for the museum down there. He built a lot of displays at Lockheed Martin.
Right, because I know that some of the items in our collection from that Crest Museum were donated by Lockheed Martin, so that's why I thought there might have been
And there were a lot of the things that were in the basement there, which you never got to see, but there was a lot of material that we had created for other displays in the Lockheed Martin center. That we had a building out at the Richland Airport that was we had a complete model shop in there.
Oh, okay.
And that's where a lot of that stuff was manufactured. And parts, I never did work in there, but we managed that, and it was what it was. It was
right.
It was as required. We did it.
Right. Is there anything else that I haven't asked you about that you'd like to mention?
Well, one of the things that I thought about in coming out here was that in the beginning, prior, in the 50s, the 40s and the 50s, there were very few illustrators. There were very few technical illustrators who knew what to do. There were a few, but on the Hanford site, that type of work was performed by sign painters. And that was a whole new world. And a lot of the big visuals back in those days were done by the sign shops. And there were a number of sign painters at Hanford. I don't know. I never did ever find out how many there were, but each area had 2 or 3 or maybe as many as 5 sign painters.
Yeah, we have a lot of signs in our collection, a lot of hand-painted signs.
But a lot of them, 99% of them, weren't painted on a board or on a piece of metal. They were painted on a tank or a wall or a series of pipes, and they became pretty crafty, and sometimes there was a little headbutting that went on between the crafts. You guys can't do that. Well, yeah, we can. Look, we did it. And well, you're not supposed to. Well, no, you're not supposed to. And so there were some near issues with union or labor and non-labor activities, but the early sign painters were really good artists, and the ones that we formatted or that we faced with, they were really good artists, and they were hardly ever recognized as such.
When did that profession, when did the sign painters start to kind of fade away on the Hanford site?
Well, they still have them, but now they all have the digital. Everything's digital and vinyl cutting, and I mean it's kind of like a graphic shop now.
Well, I imagine that would have been folded kind of into graphic design.
Yeah, but it never, to my knowledge, it's never ever. There's these guys, the ones with the X's on their stomachs and those that have zeros on their stomachs. They to my knowledge, they're still a separate entity.
Interesting. What kinds of tools did you use as an illustrator when you were doing these drawings and things? What kind of, did you have access to a pretty wide array of tools, or what?
Well, yes, we did. For the time, at the time we did. In the early days, we had typesetter setting machines that had it was black and white film, and we had fonts that were big, and you'd spin it around. If you were spelling something out, you'd spin it around, and then you'd expose it, and it would be exposed to a tape that was going through a photo bath, which are all self-contained, and it would come out the other side in these long strips. You might have 50 feet of it, and there was always problems with the process too, but we would dry that, or it'd come out and it would dry, and then we'd put it through a machine that was a waxer, and it would wax the backs of it. And we'd put it on our drawing boards, big Hamilton drawing boards with a long straight edge on it, and we'd cut out all these letters, and then we would lay them up on board, line at a time, and clean them up, and then send it to photography to have a photomechanical transfer, which was a black and white print. So, here it is, and then you could get that same, like the film that I have over here. That is a clear photo. It's a film positive, and then you can either lay that over another graphics that was airbrushed, or you could paint the back of it, and that was the one that we found on the shelf back on our tour through there, that of the interim decay storage illustration, and it's that was an evolution. We went from doing airbrush drawings where that was very, very time consuming. I brought my airbrush and some of the tools, and it was kind of a one-time deal. And back then, to be an illustrator and an artist, you had to be an illustrator and an artist. You couldn't fake it.
Right.
You had to know what you were doing. And so if you made a boo-boo, you were in trouble. And if somebody who was a good illustrator, but they were clumsy and sloppy, they didn't last very long, because you couldn't afford to have them redo it.
Right.
And so that took a lot of pretty good artists out of the picture, because they couldn't do what was required of them.
Right. Well, this sounds like it would be a great time to take a quick break and set up to view some of the materials that you brought
Sure.
to kind of illustrate, literally, so your work.
Okay.
So we'll shut it off.
Well, I'll give it a shot. What? And I've done this a few times over the years for schools and what have you, where I have everything I have a big studio, have it all laid out, and it's kind of awkward this way. But basically, an illustration is done, or was done at that time. Our client, an engineer, would contact us and come in with the stack of drawings where they needed an illustration done and what they kind of wanted as the end product. And what we would do is assign it to an illustrator, and he would start by doing a rough pencil sketch after looking at the blueprints to say, is this kind of what you want? Yes, that's what. He'd come back and after an initial rough, and then he would start plowing through all the data, and basically its drawings were to scale and oftentimes a cutaway to show how it worked, but it had to be accurate, and it had to be the right scale, and which was kind of a unique part of the job that we did. And the way we would ordinarily lay it out would be we would use all the tools we had in our tool chest to lay it out and to draw it, and we would use mechanical pencils, and this was just a pencil sharpener, and we would lay out the drawing. We would ink it then. Once it had been approved, we would transfer it to a product that was or a paper or a vellum that was of high quality, or even a mylar, and then we would ink it with fine pens that haven't used these for several years, but they were varying size ink pens, very, very accurate and very easy to work with. And these have been around for a long time. I've owned this set since the early 60s.
Wow.
And but when the illustration was laid out and done, and the engineer took a look at it, we would ask him to tell us what he wanted on a blueprint copy of to put the words on it that he wanted on it, the title. And in the beginning, the titles were normally put on with a paintbrush, and oftentimes red tempera paint, like we used to use in grade school, and it worked easy, and it went down well, and it looked nice. Any really fine illustrations, or I should say, the fonts and the wording, oftentimes if it was really important, we would use this setup, which is it's a template that has an indentation, and we would put one of these type of pins into a little bug. This is called the bug, and it would line up and in the track, and we would follow this. It's difficult to show on here, but the line would you would follow the lettering. I don't know, is this going to show or not? But you'd be producing you'd lay it on. Let's
Maybe we can you flip this part of it? Can you put this over there?
Do what now?
Hold it like that. Like maybe hold it like that so they can.
Well, it'd be wrong, but
Okay.
that would be putting it down below. It's
so
difficult. It's difficult.
Yeah.
But ultimately what it amounts to is that you'd have it would be laying down on a surface.
Yeah, so we're not really set up for the for the visual displays.
But anyway, this.
If you don't mind, I can just get closer. Maybe that'll.
Okay. Or maybe flip and have them use that, or what do you think?
Let's try just getting closer
Okay.
to it. Yeah. So I'll have to just do something here. Yeah. So out of the way. Okay.
That do it? Well, this basically is a stylus that that follows the shape of the letter, and above up here a pen would be laying down the letters one by one, and you'd move this around until you developed a sentence or a word, a call out, and so this was. It looks awkward and it looks like it's time consuming, but it isn't. I mean, when in reality it goes real quickly, and sometimes there's boo-boos. If you if you aren't watching yourself, you'll misspell something, and it's easily done. But that was this was a nice advance because we used to do it all with a red sable paintbrush. And that's how we'd put the lettering on the illustrations, and so this type of information was a giant leap forward. And then once we started getting photo paper that enabled us to technology just kept advancing us about as fast as we could keep up with it. And we'd buy stuff, and before a year is out, it was obsolete because something else had come along. So thank goodness it enabled us to provide a better end product. But this was just basically an illustration of we have a photograph, a colored photograph of one of the illustrations that shows this, and I don't know what more to say about it than that.
No, that's great. So maybe now we'll, if you feel comfortable showing, now that we've shown this, do you want to move on to the photographs? Okay.
Sure.
So what we'll do then is you'll sit where I'm sitting. I'll kind of come around to the side. We'll get the music stand up, get it focused on the stand, and I'll come and bring some of our materials over here, and then we will.
Does that go down anymore, or just tilt it?
That works.
Forward, or
I don't even know who that was. Did that.
I think that should be okay.
Can you?
It's actually seems so simple, but it's a really neat little tool. What do you?
Yeah, that.
If you want to.
No, we can.
Here, actually, I'm not really familiar with the word you got. no, I'll just be behind.
Okay.
Yeah, right here. Okay. Are we ready?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
that's okay.
So this is why don't you describe this illustration first? What it is and where we would have found it.
Okay, this was part of the fuel development activity that was an ongoing process at Hanford for nuclear fuel, and I picked this one out because it was an attractive illustration,
Mhm.
and there were techniques that we were used on this where I'm, this particular way of putting lettering on. You'll notice the lettering that the call outs that identify it, and the title on this. Those were all. This was about a 32 by 40 inch illustration,
Oh,
and
wow.
it was a black and white cutaway illustration in perspective, and it was then transferred onto an illustration board, and it was airbrushed,
Okay.
which was a time-consuming process. An illustration like this would probably take a week and a half to do, and it may be changed several times during that process. But this was an advanced technique, because prior to using these type of tools, this was often done with the paintbrush,
Wow.
and which didn't have the same sharpness and same quality. This is a very attractive illustration,
It is.
and it's very well done, and it was again an airbrushed illustration.
And so then, just to reiterate, the lettering on this illustration would have been was put on there by the same method that you demonstrated there with
Right.
the stylus and the guide.
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
And so that allows, I imagine, for a lot of kind of quality control over and consistency
Yes.
throughout the illustration, to not to distract from the information being presented.
And the bad thing about doing a lettering on something like this, after you've already done all of this and spent a week in that process, to have a boo-boo with the paintbrush or a bug, it was a disaster.
Mhm.
And you had bad dreams about things like that
Oh, geez.
if you're an illustrator. So
Right. So one of the next ones, kind of a personal favorite of mine, the one that's in our collection, all of the FFTF, is I'd like you to kind of talk about this publication. Were you in charge of the design of this?
well,
Oh, here, can we?
I wanted to see what was in it
Oh, okay.
and see. I didn't even. Yeah, these are.
Did you do the cover of this? Is this part of your group, or?
Yes. Oh,
Okay.
yes. Yeah.
So can kind of describe, if you can remember, the kind of thought that went in. This is a very kind of futuristic looking, digital, but with this kind of realistic photo drop on it. And so kind of maybe to describe the kind of the thought process behind this cover.
Well, I didn't personally draw this or lay this out. David Beckley, I think, was the illustrator that did, and he was very, very talented. And this was in celebration of the first 3 years of FFTF in operation, and it was kind of a bragging tool, if you will. It had there was one. It was expensive to do. Back in those days, it was expensive to do something like this, and it borderline pushed the edge for what was legal to do, as far as colors and all of that.
Oh, okay.
And but internally, this of course is an aerial view of the FFTF reactor that we put in there. That same illustration, and basically went through and said all sorts of, oh, there's an illustration that I did.
Okay.
And not only did I do it, but nearly every other person that worked on the FFTF project had some dealings with this, because it changed so many times. But this is an illustration that I did, and there was another illustrator who did this little section, this building here, Ron Wick, who retired recently from the supply system, and he helped with that, and I did everything else, and we submitted it, and it won an international award.
Wow.
And but this was just basically a recap of the construction milestones and the various activities as they were being, these major components as they were being installed. And so it was a classy. This brochure won an award as well for that time.
Yeah,
and,
it's very visually
yeah.
appealing with its photos. Was the cover was that done with, was that were computers used to create this cover? Was this a kind of a analog reproduction of kind of a digital?
Yeah,
like
it looks digital, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. It looks very like kind of Tron.
This is probably the third or fourth version, and I think those kind of things evolved.
Mm-hmm.
This was a good product. We were all proud to be part of that association.
Okay. So the next one is another one that we mentioned, and we'll see how if we can get this to stay. I might have to come and.
Yeah, that's.
That's all right.
That's
wow.
Pretty well.
Yeah. I might make it there for a minute. Actually,
You could probably. Well, that I think that shows it pretty well.
Yeah, it sure does. So why don't we talk about? So this is the illustration you said that won a design award.
Yes, yeah, it was. It did, and it was done. This was drawn, and of course, like I said, we did so many variations of this drawing, and it was inked, and this part here, the building itself, was a film positive, and it was a giant clear film with black lines on it, and then we painted on the back of it with acrylic.
Okay.
And it was kind of what Disney's cartoons did. You know, that's where we kind of developed this thinking of that aspect, and it made life a lot easier. It was so much faster than airbrush.
Okay.
And sort of this is kind of the step up from airbrush, and this was 32 inches wide by 40 inches long. It's actually out of that proportion. This is an illustration of this core that was also 40 inches long.
Oh wow!
And these were 40 inches long. So, and we did all of these illustrations time and time again. And the background here was done with opaque watercolor, and then this unit was laid on top of that. And so that's how it was done, and it was, you know, at that time that was kind of the state of the art.
Right. Well, sounds like there's a lot of different techniques that go into this, and
yes.
different processes.
And this was all done with sponge. I mean, this part down here was just a sea sponge, and various
Okay.
colors of dark and
Oh wow.
light paint. And the sky, the actual original, the sky was a little nicer than it is here. But that's, of course, that was kind of the setting. And so this was in nuclear engineering as their centerfold for the year
I'll show that
for,
cover real quick.
international nuclear engineering.
Does I mean you have top billing
Yeah.
right there, the
right
F50
there.
fold out
So,
chart.
yeah. I was always proud of that. We all were.
Hand painted title.
And so and so this is a hand painted title here.
Yeah, this is a paintbrush, red sable brush, and you just hand letter it to make sure that you've got it. You lay it out on a piece of paper so you know exactly the center of it and where it's going to be, and then go in with a light pencil and pencil it in so you have your spelling correct. Because it's pretty. I've even misspelled my name a few times when you're concentrating on doing it. So that's just me. So it was laid out in pencil, and then you just hold your breath and start painting after you've scribbled on a piece of scrap for a while to get the feel. If you didn't do that every day, it was kind of potluck.
Right.
And down here again, these were done with the bug.
With the stylus.
Yeah.
So
with the
why were
stylus.
some of the titles hand painted?
Well, one, they were large.
Mm-hmm.
They were, some of them were this tall, and on these illustrations, and there wasn't really any other way of at that time of that we had that you could create that.
Mm.
And so that was just part of the time frame.
That one's great.
That's awesome.
So let's talk a little bit about this.
Yeah, this was interesting. This Hank Kruger was one of our cartoonists for years out there. Had a very distinct style and a personality that was great. He was really a character. And the Hanford News was it was like it says, serving the Hanford family. And this came out once a week, and it had all sorts of information in it regarding the state of Hanford. This was a Christmas. It was actually a security. It was a security statement about where's your badge.
Yeah.
And this, I've kept this for years and years. I've shown it a lot, so it always tickles me to see it, because everything about it is it has something to do with safety, and that's how you could justify doing something like that,
Mm-hmm.
because an illustration like this doesn't happen overnight. It took a little, it cost a little to do that, but the Hanford News, for years, the whole back page of it was ads. It was kind of like the free ads that are in the Tri-City Herald today, and so there was always a lot of interest in buying a boat or duck decoys or an end table or something, and consequently it kind of distracted from the work being done on Fridays. So they normally wouldn't they wouldn't hand it out until quitting time.
Oh,
on
okay.
Fridays.
Right. That makes
So,
good
yeah,
sense.
it was.
So here we go.
Yeah, well,
This
yeah,
might be a
there's-
little small, but
Yeah.
here we have some of the ads here, right? So cars
Yeah.
for sale, wanted, and these were all for. What did it cost to, or were these all free ads?
These are all free ads.
Oh, okay.
But you had to be on site, for sale and wanted and trade and free and commuter pools, and so it was a great service, and
Right.
and all of the contractors got it. So it was a great deal.
Right. Yeah, I can imagine
So-
that this would have been.
But
quite-
that was part of what we did as well in the graphics department.
So here we go. So here is this photo has you in it, right?
Yeah, that's me. If you can
Over
believe-
on the second from the left.
Yeah, I'm the non-president, male. Yeah, this is a picture of the president of Westinghouse Hanford Company. His name was Al Squires, and this is the team that we finally pulled together after years of actually working on it. Is the final safety analysis report, FSAR. It was a major activity regarding the safety of the operation of FFTF.
Well,
It was a big job, and a lot of people supported it. And we had a special activity where they thanked us and gave us cake or something. and this was the team that was in charge of the management of it. So
this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Look kind of different.
Yeah, this is kind of different.
Yeah.
And all of the things we've scanned, all of the items that Dennis brought, and then others we'll scan and make available with the interview
yeah.
on our website. So why don't you tell us a bit about this? Seems a little different from.
Well, there was a time when the PRTR reactor building in the 300 area, it was Plutonium Research Test Reactor. It was a little domed building in the southeast part of the 300 area. They decided this would be a great place to do work on the Star Wars activities, and they were actively pursuing this when we got a new president, and it all went down with one big flush. But during that time frame, we had a lot of illustrators that got to do some neat drawings about potential activities in space. So it was indeed a Hanford
project. So the new president you're talking about, would that have been George H.W.
No, it was before that. It was back in the Carter days and times like that.
Oh, okay. So this
Yeah.
predated
Yeah.
the Star Wars, Reagan's SDI.
Yeah.
But this was some of the.
Yeah, that was. Yeah, we got excited about it for a while, but we just it didn't pan out.
Hmm.
So that's
Well, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a pretty exciting picture.
yeah.
So this here might be
I don't know. You can see that or not. That's
summary description of the fast flux.
this is called the Heddle 400, and Heddle was Hanford Engineering Development Laboratory,
Okay.
and we were basically in charge of the fast flux test facility.
Does 400 correspond to the area?
It is well, I assumed that it did. It was the
Okay.
400 area, but inside that's the negative for that FFTF, the big one.
Oh, okay.
So,
Okay.
and they handed this to me in celebration. That was in 1981, when this was produced. Pat Cabell was the editor in chief, and I was sort of his whipping boy, doing illustrations for all of the and putting the book together. Are you able to see that? A lot of the illustrations in here, I did a lot of these illustrations, and a lot of us in the groups did them. But this is the interim decay storage facility that you have an illustration for over
Right.
here. And
This right here,
this was
yeah.
the black and white version of that.
Okay.
And that illustration that you have was done with the film positive, and we painted on the back of it.
Okay.
And I put a 6 foot tall cowboy down here in the corner to show scale.
This is how large it is.
So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, great.
So this basically is the Bible, FFTF, as far as how it's constructed and how it was finalized. It's kind of an as-built.
Okay.
So
oh, great. You have the wrong Catherine.
Okay.
Yeah, that might be a good one to we don't want. I don't know if we want to go through every single
No,
one.
that wasn't my
That would be a little-
intent.
Yeah, we will make all of those available.
Did he go into detail how that whole thing was produced?
This one, I believe so. The
Yeah,
Okay.
pretty
the,
much.
the airbrush and
Yeah.
I didn't quite catch it, so we know that for the other ones.
so the Husco.
Huskabee.
So this is whole kind of Tri-Cities history, as
Yep,
you know,
yep.
WSU Tri-Cities, but also Hanford, and it's in the way of the Joint Center for Graduate. So why don't you talk about a bit about the Huskabee and your contribution to
This was there was a fellow who his name was Trent, who worked at WSU, and he Frank Trent was his name. He was a maintenance guy, and he was an artist, and he was asked to come up with a critter that was part husky, part cougar, and part beaver, and they were initially going to use it for the first graduation, the diploma, as a kind of a logo, and he struggled with it, and then he came to me and said, "Hey, can you help me?" and so I came up with a black and white version, and they liked it, and so he then came back later and they had me do an oil painting of it, and so this is part of an oil painting it's a little bit large. I mean, it shows the riverbank and the river in the distance and all of that, and it hung here at the college for years, and I think somewhere it's still hanging. I hope.
So
Hope
here's
it is.
another.
Oh yeah.
We'll have to come up here, and so a little more. So this is Professor Emeritus Ron Catherine, who has been interviewed by us and Herbert Parker Foundation, longtime health physics professional, and proud Coug, holding the oil painting of the Huskabee as on our 20th celebration, which I think would have been in 2008 or 2009.
Yeah.
And so this was the final painting.
That's the painting.
That was done.
It hung in this building upstairs as you came in. For years and years, it was there. I used to come out here for art classes at night and on the weekends, and it always hung there, and I was always so proud of it. But it was an unusual illustration.
Yeah, it's probably maybe the most unusual college mascot I've ever seen.
It didn't last for long.
Okay, so this will be our last one here. Both of them? Or
The hand-drawn part one.
this one?
Yeah. I
Okay.
don't know if we show it. Okay.
So this isn't a final, right?
No,
This
that's considered a rough,
okay.
and that was, we did ongoing. That was a big part of our activity at Hanford in the graphics department was safety and security,
Right.
and it kept a lot of people employed because they were always wanting something new to. It was they were real serious about safety and security, which is great.
Yeah, when you're dealing with nuclear
Yeah.
reactors, yeah. And then Hanford safety record is very well documented. Okay, well that's great.
Yeah.
So Dennis, thank you so much for coming and
Well,
sharing your story and walking us
This
through the
was fun.
process.
this was fun.
Oh, great. Well,
We
thank
could
you.
probably keep this up for a couple hours.
Yeah.